to launch the largest single market under a free trade area in Africa, comprising 26 countries, which is half of the membership of the African Union, with a combined population of 625 million people, almost half the population of China, with a GDP of 1.3 trillion US dollars. So we are heading for that.
From Cape to Cairo, trading in Africa could soon become a whole lot easier. The Tripartite Free Trade Area will unite 3 existing trade blocs into the largest single market on the continent and could raise intra-African trade by 52%. But a continent-wide deal could also create new economic dynamics, and trade experts have cautioned that there is still much to do before the dream becomes reality. So how exactly will the Tripartite Free Trade Area function, and could this be the economic break the continent's been searching for? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, Africa has made the first major step towards a continental free trade area, a common market spanning half the continent. It is to be called the Tripartite Free Trade Area, or the TFTA. Now, this is how it works. As the map here shows you, the TFTA runs all the way from Cairo in Egypt to Cape Town, sitting on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean in South Africa. To create the Tripartite Free Trade Area, 3 existing trading blocs have been collapsed into one. And these are the Southern African Development Community, the SADC, the Common Market for East and Southern African Countries, COMESA, and the East African Community, the EAC. As you can see here, some of these countries have overlapping memberships belonging to more than one trading bloc at the same time. Now put together, COMESA, SADC and the EAC, and it forms the new TFTA. Combined, the TFTA brings together 26 countries with a population of 625 million, which is just slightly over half of Africa's population of 1.01 billion people. The total GDP of the TFTA is $1 trillion US dollars out of Africa's combined GDP of 1.643 trillion US dollars, according to 2013 World Bank data. But there is one major problem with this arrangement. Apart from reinforcing the Francophone and the Anglophone Africa divide, the TFTA also leaves out the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS, and the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, the CEMAC. With a GDP of 510 billion US dollars, Africa's biggest economy, Nigeria, which by itself accounts for nearly 78% of ECOWAS's GDP, the TFTA has left out a major player in Africa's economic development. So just how was the TFTA's geographical location determined, and what benefits does it bring to its member states? While negotiations for a continental free trade agreement were launched at the African Union Summit earlier this month and come off the back of the ratification of the separate Tripartite Free Trade Agreement signed in Egypt. Now, CCTV's Girum Chala sat down with the AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Fatima Haram, to find out what was agreed upon and how they plan to implement this.
The African Union is preparing to launch the Continental Free Trade Area. So what exactly is set out in the Continent's Free Trade Area Agreement?
The first phase will deal more with trade in services and trades in goods. Then the second phase will deal with, migration issues, will deal with, intellectual property rights, procurement, and so forth. However, even though this, especially the migration issue, the movement of people, was clearly discussed at length at the Head of State Summit, and we think that is very, very important, especially given the challenges that we have on the continent, on the migration, and our people dying on the sea. How do we ensure that we open our border? How do we ensure that we also allow movement of talent in our continent? So we are really hopeful, and then really this conversation started very in an early stage.
Now, how does this differ from the Tripartite Trade Agreement signed in Egypt earlier this month?
The Tripartite is really composed of 3 different regional blocks. The African Union, is 8 different regional blocks. The 3 different regional blocks is East Africa, EAC, the COMESA, and also the SADC. Now, the Tripartite is 26 countries. Now, when you talk about the Continental Free Trade Area, it's 54 countries. And it's a very, very good basis for the continental free trade area because, again, the tripartite is part of the 54 countries. And therefore, it's a really a key for us. It's a really solid background. And that's why we think that really having our continental free trade area by 2017 is going to be possible because we already have, we're not starting from zero. We have a good, solid background. 26 countries signing already a free trade area.
You understand that intra-Africa trade is currently roughly only 12% of trade on the continent. Can the bloc be expected to function with such low levels? And how can this be improved?
I think, first of all, the 12% is an accurate number, but as you know, the 12% do not capture the informal trade. So there is a lot of informal trade. When I talk about the cross-border trade, some of the time is not captured by custom because it's informal. So I think that, yes, we can talk about formal 12%, which is very, very low compared to, Europe when we talk about 60%, North America 40%, and in Asia like 30%. So we need to do definitively something about it. But I think that is very important when you talk, because of our intra-African trade is so low, we have the continental free trade area will address that because, first of all, it's a huge market. That's one. The second thing is it will justify the big amount of investment that is required on the continent, even for the infrastructure, because right now our markets are too small and too fragmented to justify a big amount of investment for infrastructure. So the continental free trade area will allow us to attract bigger investment. That's one. It will allow us to produce better because now the concept of the value chain will come. It doesn't mean that country A will produce everything in that country A. We can, specialize. For example, if we're producing a car, country A will produce that part, country B will produce that part, and then it will be like, the concept of made in Africa will emerge. So I think it's very important. Again, the youth employment is going to address this. The issue of transforming the raw material, everybody is known. We have the fastest growth economy in this continent, 6 out of 10. And I think that everybody knows our story is that we are trading raw material. And it's very important that we transform our raw material in this continent. So it will attract investment. It will make sure that, the transfer of technology, the know-how for our youth, it will help us. We will transform in this continent. We will produce for this continent. The demand is there. It's a million people. So I think that it's very, very important that, this continental free trade area, even when you talk about connecting Africa via train, via, rail, I think that it's important when you don't have, a procedure at the border that will help you. You can have the fastest train possible. You can come on the border and then you can sit for 1 day. So, it's becoming useless. So the continental free trade will address all of these issues on our continent.
And to help make sense of how the tripartite free trade area will work, we have our expert guest standing by for us in Nairobi. Here joining me in studio is Julian Samboko. He's a research analyst at StratLink Africa. Mark Schumann is joining me from Johannesburg. He's a researcher at the South African Institute for International Affairs. And from Boston in the United States, Professor Calestas Juma. He's a professor of the practice of international development, Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you all for joining us in this discussion today. Professor Calestas Juma in the US, I'll start off with you now. The TFTA has been termed as possibly the most significant event in Africa since the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. Explain to us just how significant is this and what does this involve that hasn't been achieved before on the continent?
Thank you so much for having me. When Africa started to embark seriously on decolonization, it was dealing with the fragmentation of the continent politically. And so we got the independence as a separate countries. Those countries continued to trade essentially with their former colonies. They didn't diversify their economies. They continued to export raw materials. What is happening at the moment is a product of incremental industrial development within Africa itself, And that's creating a new opportunity for African countries to move from political emancipation to industrial, technological, and economic emancipation. And that's why I equate it with the original really creation of an Africa, which was with a vision of a unified continent. That vision could not be realized without economic integration, and that's what's happening at the moment. And I think it's really exciting. It's a really a new Africa that is emerging at the moment.
A new economic Africa that is emerging. 26 countries, though, having come together in the TFTA. Julian, to you, though, this is all rather ambitious when you look at the scale of what Africa is trying to achieve. How will this all be implemented?
Thank you very much for having me, Beatrice. I think the most important thing to realize is that for the longest while, we have had a number of regional blocs in Africa which have been affected by the case of dual membership. For example, Tanzania is a member of SADC, it's a member of EAC, and therefore the TFTA coming at this point, I think it seeks to streamline some of those redundancies we've been having, and I think the most critical thing is that we have a protocol, if I may call it, in place, and I think the implementation will be based essentially on the sort of political will it receives.
There is the political will that is going to receive, but to you though, Mark Schumann, in Johannesburg, is this bound to disappoint? What's your take?
Thanks, Beatrice. I think this is definitely a very important milestone. The current agreement is a result of the last 5 years of negotiations, and that's certainly a significant achievement. But I do think that we should be skeptical about celebrating the benefits of this too early, for a number of reasons. For example, currently only 16 of the 26 potential member states have actually signed the agreement, and there are a number of countries that are a little bit wary about signing it before they fully understand the economic implications in their own country. So that may take some time. For example, South Africa, which has been one of the greatest proponents of the TFTA, hasn't actually yet signed the agreement, probably because South Africa exists in its own Southern African customs union with its immediate neighbors, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland, and they all have a common external tariff. So in order for them to enter into this agreement and reduce tariffs for the other member states, they have to all agree to this. So there's going to be some obstacles in terms of getting all the rest of the member states to actually sign on to this agreement. And then after that, there's a period of 2 years where the agreement has to be ratified and implemented in terms of domestic legislation. And there are a couple of challenges there as well.
Right.
And then after that process is completed, there's some questions about how important tariff liberalization is compared to, for example, non-tariff barriers to trade. And if we take the example of the SADC free trade area, which was signed in 2008, it hasn't helped that much to increase intra-SADC trade. We now understand because of non-tariff barriers to trade, things like customs, procedures, and a lack of transport infrastructure. So those are also important things to consider for the future.
All right, Professor Juma, though, should we be skeptical before celebrating here at this point?
I think what is being celebrated is the vision of a larger market. It's not, we are not celebrating the benefits yet. I think what's important is to recognize that Africa has been experimenting with the trade, and there are clear signals that we have a growing, an increase in the trade in manufactured products, in intermediate products. And so by creating a regional market, you send the signal that it's now possible to start investing on a larger scale. And it's that signaling mechanism that is extremely important. At the moment, nobody's interested in putting money in infrastructure, which is essential in moving goods and services, because we don't have an agreement. I also agree with Mark's point that this is going to take time, because trade really is a product of trust among nations. And that trust comes when you start to trade. It will not come before you have started to trade.
All right, we're going to take a short break now on the program, but when we come back, we'll debate the feasibility of a free trade zone in Africa. Do stay with us.
We still have a long way ahead of us before this agreement enters into force. We need to finalize our negotiations on the exchange of tariff offers, the rules of origin and trade remedies, we must complete the ratification procedures. In addition, let's be realistic. We will face unforeseen challenges, but the rewards are definitely worth the efforts needed to overcome those challenges.
The rewards will be worth it. That was Egyptian Minister of Trade and Industry Munir Fakhri Abdel Noor speaking about the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement signed in Egypt earlier this month. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, the TFTA agreement has not been immune to criticism. Greater regional integration has faced well-documented problems in the past, including infrastructural barriers and border post delays. And as mentioned earlier, not all countries have been included in the initial agreement, as was pointed out by Nigerian analyst Bismarck Rwani.
Earlier this month, representatives from 25 African nations signed an initial agreement that will bring together more than 60% of the continent's gross domestic product, valued at $1.2 trillion, including two of the most developed economies in Africa, South Africa and Egypt. But Nigeria, the continent's largest economy and most populous, will be kept out of the zone. Although analysts say that the agreement looks like a progressive step on paper, they're skeptical of its success, as it will require negotiations and ratification by national parliaments.
If you take African GDP of $1.2 trillion, Nigeria's GDP is already 35% of African GDP. If Nigeria is not part of this, then any African economic story without Nigeria is totally incomplete. So it's a good objective, and it has to be approved by each of the countries, the parliaments of each of these countries. There are 54 African countries. It'll be extremely difficult to see all of these countries passing it, because it needs free flow of goods, free flow of people, free flow of investment.
According to analysts, other factors to consider before implementing the deal are language barriers, as well as the need to develop intra-African infrastructure, which is minimal and in a poor state.
The challenges are that it is a very bureaucratic system. These countries, some of them are Arabic speaking, some of them are English speaking, some of them are French speaking. They cuts across, the infrastructure doesn't support and facilitate this, because you cannot drive a car or enter a train from Cairo to Cape Town, right? So it's a very, very elegant concept, but it's going to take a long time to accomplish, and not to talk of when you see the benefits. The benefits take much longer to accrue to the participating countries.
The TFTA was widely welcomed by the world business community, with many praising the new protocol, which would put in place a harmonized trade regime. But with so many obstacles in the way, some analysts have suggested strengthening the smaller regional trade blocs that are already in existence before adopting larger agreements which present far more challenging issues.
Before you combine those three groups, it is first to make those work first, and so they can see the benefits of a combination, rather than trying to combine 54 African countries. So if ECOWAS as a group can work towards an improvement in the economic conditions of West Africa, if the EAC, the East African Community, which is working very well, can do that and improve the quality of life and the economic output in East Africa, then if the SADC, which is South African Development Area, can do that, then you have it. But right now you can see what's happening in South Africa. They are even pushing foreigners away. So on one hand, they are pushing foreigners out. On the other hand, they are saying you're trying to integrate. So there's some inconsistency there.
Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
Well, let's get back now to the discussion. My guest is still with me, Julian Zamboko, research analyst at StratLink Africa, Mark Schumann, researcher at the Southern African Institute for International Affairs in Johannesburg, and Professor Calestas Juma, professor of the Practice of International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School, joining us from the U.S. Julian, first to you. Egypt's trade minister there said there would be unforeseen challenges. I mean, it will be worth it, but there will be unforeseen challenges here. What are those challenges, do you think?
I think just borrowing from the recent history we've had, if you're to look at the East African community as a case in point, whereas we appreciate that the East African protocol provides for variable geometry, for instance, whereby in view of the larger economic bloc, if two or so nations have agreed on something, they can proceed forward. We have experienced undertones of political disquiet, for example, where Tanzania and Burundi have been labeled as coalition of the unwilling, and Kenya and Uganda, for instance, have been labeled as the coalition of the willing. And therefore, that kind of friction is likely to be one of the unforeseen challenges being mentioned by the Egyptian official.
Professor Juma, though, if the regional economic communities cannot get it right up to this point, is there any hope really for the TFTA?
I think there's the assumption that a free trade area has to be perfect is actually a wrong one. There is no free trade area in the world that is actually perfect. Problems arise. One of the important functions of a free trade area is that you have a mechanism for ironing out those differences and sorting them as you go. It's a process of continuous learning and experimentation. When the negotiations were launched in 2008, it was estimated that the value of the market, the GDP of the market, was roughly $650 billion. We are now, just in a very short period, we see this significant increase in estimates, which is roughly $1.3 trillion. A large part of that has been a recognition of the trade that has already been going on within the regional bodies. So I think we can look at the challenges that need to be solved, but we also need to look at the opportunities and the experiences of Africans themselves in expanding trade among themselves. The negotiators are not building this from nothing. They are actually building it from past experiences.
All right, Mark Schumann, though, are we seeing this sort of success, though, with the Southern African Development Community? Because the SADC's trade protocol, which was signed by about 11 members, wanted to liberalize 85% of intra-regional trade by 2008, 100% by 2012. All these were missed. Are we seeing much success, though, to build upon from SADC?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a valid criticism to say that these regional economic communities within their own territories have not been as successful as perhaps they could have been. But I think from the SADC context, SADC actually has a lot to benefit from cooperating in such an agreement with the other regional economic communities. In a lot of areas, SADC is widely regarded to be less far down its integration plan than other regional economic communities like the EAC and COMESA. And SADC can definitely benefit from some of these positive effects rubbing off on its own policies. For example, in preparation for this TFTA, all three of the regional economic communities implemented a non-tariff barrier monitoring mechanism, which allows companies engaging in cross-border trade to register and notify countries that are implementing non-tariff barriers to trade. And that's definitely been a helpful and an important improvement that SADC probably wouldn't have implemented if it hadn't been part of this agreement in the first place.
Julian, so we are seeing the absence of Nigeria, Africa's largest economy here, is not part of the tripartite free trade area. What was the consideration, though, for the countries or for the groupings that came together to form the TFTA?
2 points on that, Beatrice. First of all is that we are only talking about the TFTA. If you look at the wider spectrum for the continental free trade area, which is targeted for 2017, there is the provision for negotiations between the TFTA and ECOWAS, which includes Nigeria. And I think the spirit underlying this is that there should be some reasonable measure of macroeconomic convergence between nations uniting to form a trade or economic bloc. And I think it's important that we establish them first between the three blocks, EAC, SADC, and COMESA, and then gravitate it more towards the ECOWAS section. And I think the most important thing is that right now we are seeing a sense in which there is the mainstreaming of trade and liberalization of policies across the entire continent.
Professor Callistus Juma, though, is that a concern that Africa's largest economy is missing from this TFTA?
Nigeria needs to provide leadership in West Africa with its neighboring countries and the other regional bodies in West Africa, so they can do for West Africa what has been done for Eastern and Southern Africa. That's a responsibility that Nigeria should take as a leading economy in that region. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is that with the creation of the tripartite arrangement, large manufacturing investments are likely to start drifting towards Eastern and Southern Africa because that's where there is the opening up of markets. So if Nigeria doesn't move quickly and provide leadership in West Africa, in fact, we're going to be seeing a shifting of the center of gravity for manufacturing towards Eastern and Southern Africa. So the onus is really on Nigeria to take up the leadership, not to say it has been excluded, because it's not part of Eastern and Southern Africa. It's part of Western Africa. It should provide leadership in that region.
What would be the impact, though, Professor Calestis Juma? What would be the impact on smaller economies like Rwanda, like Burundi, like Namibia? What would be the impact on those countries?
It's actually quite interesting. The assumption is that the smaller countries are likely to lose out. But all the studies that have been done by independent analysts, studies in COMESA, actually show that smaller countries that are within larger blocks can start to specialize in certain areas. Those countries like Lesotho, for example, that already are building up textile industries, they now have the opportunity to expand that to other regions of the continent by being able to market their products. Similarly, with Rwanda, which has provided leadership in information and communications technologies, it was being restricted mostly to East Africa. But now, with the tripartite trade area, it has the opportunity to expand its trading operations across the whole region. So it's really going to be driven by the entrepreneurs in those smaller countries that see where the opportunities actually lie.
Mark Schumann, we're going to wind up in a moment, but a final point at you, although you're all very upbeat about this TFTA for Africa. Mark, what do you think it will take to work, though? First, will it work, and what will it take to work?
I think, unfortunately, particularly in the African context, there's a history of political leaders making agreements and committing to these kinds of Pan-African ideals in political rhetoric, and then often those values and those principles are not trickling down to the way that policy is implemented by bureaucrats on the ground. So really, I think that in order for this to be successful, we're going to have to see a very strong push from the highest officers in each of the member states to really make this program a success, making sure that trade and industry ministries are given the provisions that they need from the highest officers in the land to be able to put this into domestic legislation, to make these tariff liberalization movements a reality, and then certainly political coordination on the industrial policy and the infrastructure development fronts is going to be a huge challenge, and that really is just going to depend on whether or not we see this political will being sustained in the next 10 to 15 years.
Julian Tamboko?
The biggest challenge from where I stand is the question of data reliability. I think as a researcher that's a big issue. And what is critically important is that we need data consistency and comparability across borders. If you look at, for instance, that last year we had Nigeria rebasing their economy, and overnight it was 89% larger. And therefore those kind of issues, especially when you're talking about such a large block, will be key points to look at.
Professor Calestis Juma?
I think the most important political lobby and driver of the creation of this market is going to be industrialists. When you start to get industrialists that are interested in investing in trans-border commercial interactions, those are the ones who are going to generate pressure on governments to make sure that the tariffs are reduced, the infrastructure is in place, corruption is reduced to actually make it work. So we should be starting to talk more with entrepreneurs and industrialists, because they are really the champions of trade.
All right, Mboko Julius joining us here in Nairobi, research analyst at StratLink Africa. Mark Schumann, a researcher at the South African Institute for International Affairs, and Professor Calestis Juma from the Harvard Kennedy School in the USA joining us. Thank you all for joining us here on the program. And that's all we have time for this week. Remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. To join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.